Hi, everyone. This is the Hungry Math Professor here, and thank you for coming to my channel. And today I want to discuss Uncertainty by Ludwig Wittgenstein. I already recorded another video on Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations, and I would recommend that you watch that one first. So I will review some of that, and they are separate topics, but they are informed by each other. And also, you should first listen to my discussion of G.E. Moore's Defense of Common Sense because Wittgenstein constantly brings up Moore in his book. And I'll tell you why as we go through it. But I just want to say that, Wittgenstein lived from 1889 to 1951. He's a part of the analytic philosophy movement. He was a student of Bertrand Russell, and early on in his life seemed to take up a similar type of philosophy to Bertrand Russell and some sort of logical atomism, though his own flavor of that. But then later in his life, he completely rejected some of those base assumptions and gave a very different version of philosophy of language, which is what he talks about primarily in philosophical investigations. And a lot of that continues, his discussion continues in Uncertainty. But Uncertainty was finished in 1951. Though when we say finished, really, Wittgenstein dies in 1951, and so this is all first draft material, and but it's been published as such. And sometimes you can tell it's first draft material because there seems to be comments that Wittgenstein is making almost to himself that he wants to edit something later. Though sometimes it's hard to tell with Wittgenstein because even in philosophical investigations, sometimes it feels like he's making comments to himself or parenthetical comments. So uh, I would say it's very readable. I would say even more readable than the philosophical investigations, though you need to have some understanding of some of the ideas in philosophical investigations to understand, I think, Uncertainty. But you could just get those ideas by Googling some Wittgenstein. You could understand language games and what does it mean for meaning is used. And then you can read Uncertainty, and it's a much easier read, I would say, much more straightforward. Though it is written as a series of aphorisms, right? They're just numbered paragraphs. Sometimes they're just a sentence, sometimes it's several paragraphs, and they're each numbered. And sometimes it's funny because sometimes the numbered paragraphs clearly are in concert with each other and they could have all been one number. And sometimes he clearly does jump around and they don't seem to be very directly related in order. Same thing is true in philosophical investigations. And I want to go and read quite a few of them and discuss them as a way of engaging with this text. Before I do that, though, let me just remind you of some of the things that um, Wittgenstein establishes in philosophical investigations. First of all, he doesn't think that words get a completely precise meaning. He doesn't think that there's some like universal language out there that every other language can be um, translated into. Instead, he thinks that the meaning of words comes through how they're used. He thinks that that's how we come to understand the meaning of words. Um, and so, depending on how you use the words, you will infer a meaning, intended meaning. But that intended meaning is not necessarily like one precise meaning of what that word is, but rather I like to think about, this is not Wittgenstein's word. I like to think about it as like a cloud of meaning around the word that gets like sort of chopped down by the use, and it's never like particularly pinpointed one meaning, but rather it gets sort of the cloud gets precise enough to where I'm able to use it. So like an example of that is red, right? Sometimes when I use the word red, I have a very precise idea of what I mean by red. Other times, I'm willing to accept, like all kinds of things as being red that maybe are more closer to what other people think of purple. And anyway, the point is that I infer what people mean by the word red by how they use it. And in science, you might use it to mean something very specific about, a wavelength or something like that. But he thinks that all words are like this, and and that we never really get a precise meaning. And then on top of that, he thinks that we design these different language games where we have different uses for words. So red is another good example because in science, when we use the word red, we generally have something very specific in mind, maybe a particular wavelength, depending on what area of science we're in. Um, and maybe if we're doing neuroscience, we may have some particular brain image in mind or neurons in mind that have are associated with red. Or but in everyday life, I can use the word red in various different ways. Sometimes just to distinguish, one type of apple from another type of apple. Sometimes I have very precise, it seems like, version of red in mind versus other red, green, other types of red. And um, that's just one example, but in general, we have he thinks we have all these different language games where we use words differently, and we go in and out of these language games when we talk to different people. And we're not always even consciously aware of this. We just kind of like do it um, by just kind of going about, and we just kind of understand implicitly that we need to explain things differently or talk slightly differently in order to communicate with different people when we step in and out of these different language games. But in uncertainty, he's going to use some of those concepts at times. He's going to even use the word language game throughout at different points in time to investigate the idea of what does it mean to know something, and what does it mean to be certain of something? Like, what does certainty even mean? Again, if you remember, Moore seems to be very certain that he has a right hand, he has a left hand. He's very certain that he has a body. And he just declares these things, what I would say dogmatically. I know this, right? And Wittgenstein finds this very interesting. He says that this was one of Moore's best writings, was Moore's writing of Defense of Common Sense and Proof of the External World. I don't think Wittgenstein had a very high view of Moore as a philosopher, so I'm not sure, that this should be taken as like high praise. But he does. It's famously known that Wittgenstein said that he thought this was like Moore's best writing. But I would say I much prefer Wittgenstein's discussion of what it means to know something than I do Moore's, because Moore just seems to declare it, right? And but it is useful for Wittgenstein to use Moore as an example to explain how he thinks of certainty. And I just want to go through and read some quotes from this. And sometimes I'll discuss it, and sometimes I'll just move on to the next quote. But the first one is the first aphorism in this collection. If you do know that here is one hand, will grant you all the rest. When one says that such and such a proposition can't be proved, of course, that does not mean that it can't be derived from other propositions. Any proposition can be derived from other ones, but they may be no more certain than it is itself. Here, I think he's actually pointing to something that more, he doesn't say it so explicitly, but he does say, I think, he basically says this in Proof of the External World, that, you know, um, if you grant me certain premises, I can prove anything you want. And if I'm able to change the premises, I can get a different conclusion. So there is this issue with what we mean when we ask someone to prove something to us, like what would count as a proof, right? And so he starts out with that sort of acknowledgement. In aphorism 18, I know, the statement I know often means I have the proper grounds for my statement. So if the other person is acquainted with the language game, he would admit that I know. The other, if he is acquainted with the language game, must be able to imagine how one may know something of this kind. So again, I think he employs language games here to point out that the statement I know can mean very different things in different contexts, in different language games. And this is something that Moore does not seem to acknowledge at all. And so later Wittgenstein is going to point out that the skeptic, when they say that you do or do not know something is kind of playing a different language game. It's playing the skeptical language game. And when an idealist says that they don't know that they're physical objects, they're playing a slightly different language game. And when Moore says that he knows it, he's also playing a different language game, which is to say, he's playing the language game of common sense that I'm going to go around and when I live my life, I'm going to assume that there are physical objects out there. But again, I think Wittgenstein brings a very important point to this discussion, which is that what it means to know something or what it means to be certain about something is relative to the language game that we're playing or the context that we're playing in. And this to me is Moore's biggest mistake. I mean, shouldn't philosophers be able to play different language? Shouldn't they be able to be skeptical of these everyday facts and not have that be absolutely absurd and not have you just yell and say that yeah, of course there are external objects that it's confusing. Anyway, we'll keep reading some of these aphorisms and you'll see Wittgenstein also saying some of these similar things. So now I'm at 136 through 137. When Moore says he knows such and such, he is really enumerating a lot of empirical propositions which we affirm without special testing. Propositions, that is, which have a peculiar logical role in the system of our empirical propositions. Even if the most trustworthy of men assures me that he knows things are thus and so, this by itself cannot satisfy me that he does know, only that he believes he knows. That is why Moore's assurance that he knows does not interest us. The propositions, however, which Moore retails as examples of such known truths are indeed interesting, not because anyone knows their truth or believes he knows them, but because they all have a similar role in the system of our empirical judgments. So again, Wittgenstein is pointing out that in some sense, Moore is right that these are things that we take for granted when we are doing science or when we're doing everyday life, and that these are reasonable things to take for granted. But he also thinks that a philosopher should point out that we don't know them with any kind of certainty. They're simply facts that we take for granted, right? And again, I just feel so much more refreshing the way that Wittgenstein handles this. So now let's move to 192. Though I'll be interested if you don't feel that way. Please point that out to me. In 192, to be sure there is justification, but justification comes to an end. This shows up all throughout the philosophical investigations as well. Wittgenstein keeps pointing out this idea that when we give an explanation or justification, there's always an end to that. And at the end of that justification, one question we can ask is, what is at the end of that justification? What are the kinds of things that come at the end? And why are we giving justifications at all, right? And what games are we playing when we do that? I'll continue this discussion as we move on to other ones. So in 196, he says, sure evidence is what we accept as sure. It is evidence that we go by in acting surely, acting without any doubt. And again, I think what's important to point out is this happens in everyday life, that depending on who I'm interacting with, I implicitly understand that what they're going to require to feel certain of something is different. And when I'm talking to a scientist, there's a different game that we play and different set of facts that I know they are going to want in order to feel certain of some truth. When I talk to mathematicians, I know that there's a different type of argument or a different type of justification that I'll give to them and that will make them feel like something is certain. And when I talk to my family, I will interact with them differently in how I will get them to feel certain. The point is that I know that all these different people are happy with different base assumptions about how the world works, and I know where their justification ends and how I need to give them justification to get them to a certain fact that I think that they should take as truth. We'll continue this discussion as we go forward and read some more of these aphorisms. In 204, he says, giving grounds, however, justifying the evidence, comes to an end. But the end is not certain propositions striking us immediately as true, i.e., it is not a kind of seeing on our part. It is our acting, which lies at the bottom of the language game. Here, this reminds me of what sometimes are called self-evident truths. Because when you try to set up an axiomatic system to like establish the truths of mathematics, for instance, you are immediately faced with an issue which people are aware of, that at the very base there are these axioms. These axioms require certain symbols and words to be taken for granted. And if you want to establish truth as like absolutely certain, there's an issue, because how do I know that the axioms are true, right? I know if I take the axioms as for granted, I can then build from there using certain logical rules, which I also have to take for granted. But I can build from there and come up with all kinds of theorems of mathematics, which I can be certain of. But the problem is that I can never be certain of the axioms, right? I have no argument for the axioms, because otherwise it wouldn't be a foundation. And so oftentimes people have made this move of saying, well, the axioms are just self-evident truths that we take for granted. And but also self-evident truth, like what the heck does that mean? Like again, we're playing this weird game. If I want to establish something as absolute certain, I don't want to just declare things to be self-evident truths, right? And so Wittgenstein is pointing out that these grounds that we give for him don't have to be like axioms of mathematics, but can be, for example, but these grounds that we have for our beliefs, um, you know, they come to an end, and they're not certain. These propositions are not certain. They're just the things that we take for granted when we play a certain language game, and we should be honest about that, right? And I just so much more prefer the honesty of Wittgenstein's discussion over the what I see as just the dogmatism of Moore's discussion, which just makes me so frustrated. Let's keep going with this discussion and go to 253. So in 253, Wittgenstein says, at the foundation of well-founded belief lies belief that is not founded. It just has to be, right. You can't, the justification has to end somewhere. And there will always be some beliefs at the very base which are not justifiable in any sense. So now let's move to 310. Here, I'm not going to read it all, but he goes through this discussion of like a pupil and a teacher. When a teacher is trying to teach something to their student, you want to imagine this student who is just constantly being skeptical right away. And what Wittgenstein points out is that you can't be skeptical. I mean, you can, but he points out that like this doesn't really work if a student is constantly skeptical of every single thing the teacher says. Then at some point the teacher will just throw their hands up and will stop trying to work with the student, or will consider their questions to be annoying. Because what Wittgenstein keeps pointing out is that you have to take some things for granted in order to even go somewhere with the teacher. And then later you can try to backtrack and be skeptical as a way of trying to maybe understand your beliefs better, or maybe as a way of trying to reject certain beliefs in favor of other ones. But he points out over and over again in this book that in order to be skeptical, you have to like start believing something. Otherwise you don't get anywhere, right? And so he points out that like certainty or belief is a part of the language game of skepticism, of being skeptical, right? But this pupil and teacher discussion, it reminded me of myself as a kid. When I was in fourth grade, I had this teacher, Miss Cernicki, and for whatever reason in that particular grade, I would just ask so many questions that basically were like, why? Miss Cernicki would teach us something and I would ask, but why? Why is that true? And I would do this kind of incessantly. And I'm sure it was annoying for Miss Cernicki, because in some sense, some of these questions don't have a good answer. And it is kind of annoying, but it was my personality. I mean, in some sense, it's not surprising given who I've become and how I think about the world. But for whatever reason, at that point in my life, I was like particularly incessant about asking these why questions. And I will give Miss Cernicki a lot of credit, because she was extremely patient with me. She could have just gotten angry with me or frustrated, and I'm sure she got a little bit frustrated, but she never really showed that to me. And she was extremely patient, and I remember her to this day because of her patience. And especially now that I'm older, I really appreciate the fact that I understand as a human being she didn't have to be so patient, because I'm sure it was annoying. But if Miss Hernicky happens to be listening to this, I really do appreciate your patience, and I remember you for that ever, up until this day. But as I've gotten older, I am still a very skeptical person, and I enjoy these kinds of questions. But I also understand that there's a time and place for those questions, and we can't just live our lives constantly asking why and constantly being in doubt. And you may want to check out Wittgenstein's discussion of this in 317 through 326. Or sorry, 310. Sorry, 310 through 317. But I don't want to read all of that right now. So let's move to 325. So when we say that we know that such and such, we mean that any reasonable person in our position would also know it, that it would be a piece of unreason to doubt it. Thus, Moore too wants to say not merely that he knows that he, etc., but also that anyone endowed with reason in his position would know it just the same. But who says what is reasonable to believe in this situation? Right. So again, Wittgenstein acknowledges that there's a language game being pointed out here. When you say that you know something, you're basically signaling that the kinds of people that find themselves in similar situations that make similar assumptions would also agree that they know such and such, right? And that's a reasonable language game. We all do that. Like when I talk to my family, I know that there are certain things that we're willing to take for granted. When I talk to mathematicians or scientists or Christians or non-Christian, all these different kinds of groups of people, I know basically what it is that we take for granted and what it counts as the kinds of things that we're certain about. But again, Wittgenstein is important to point out in 326. But who says what it is reasonable to believe in this situation? Right, that's an important question to ask. Why is it that these are the things that we think are reasonable? And can we doubt that, or should we doubt it? And who is making those determinations, right? Moving on to 336. Here he says, but what men consider reasonable or unreasonable alters. At certain periods, men find reasonable what other periods they found unreasonable, and vice versa. But is there no objective character here? Very intelligent and well educated people believe in the story of creation in the Bible, while others hold it as proven false. And the grounds of the latter are well known to the former. Yeah, so he's just pointing out that if at a very grounds, the very base assumptions are different between two different groups of people, then they can both be reasonable in some sense, but come to very different conclusions. And it's hard to argue one versus the other. This is going to come up again, so let me continue to push through and read these things as we discuss. So in 341 through 343, he says, that is to say, the questions that we raise in our doubts depend on the fact that some propositions are exempt from doubt, are as it were like hinges on which those turn. That is to say, it belongs to the logic of our scientific investigations that certain things are indeed not doubted. But it isn't that the situation is like this. We just can't investigate everything. And for that reason, we are forced to rest content with assumption. If I want the door to turn, the hinges must stay put. And I specifically want to point these things out because on certainty has been used by others to form what's called hinge epistemology, which is clearly being talked about here in Wittgenstein's 341 through 343, though he talks about it other places. And it's an epistemology that says basically that there are these certain hinges to our beliefs. And we can't doubt the hinges. We cannot justify the hinges. They are just assumptions that we make. And then from these hinges, we can build up, all kinds of extra beliefs on top of them that can be justified. And if me and you share certain hinges, then we can build together and justify our beliefs, or kind of work backwards in order to justify to you why I believe the certain things that I do. But if our hinges are different, if the base assumptions that we make at the very bottom are different, then we may find it difficult to talk to each other, or we may have to just agree to disagree because there's no way to get from the hinges or the assumptions that I make to the beliefs that I have And there's maybe no other way to do the same thing from the hinges that you have to the beliefs that I have. And at some point we may have to just agree to disagree, right? I think this is an important thing to reflect on. Like, what do we do when we're discussing something with someone and we realize that our fundamental assumptions are different? How do we handle that situation? There'll be more of this discussion as we move forward. So let's go to 403 to 407. So here, to say of man in more sense that he knows something, that what he says is therefore unconditionally the truth, sings wrong to me. It is the truth only inasmuch as it is an unmoving foundation of his language game. I want to say it's not that on some points men know the truth with perfect certainty. No, perfect certainty is only a matter of their attitude. But of course, there is still a mistake even here. What I'm aiming at is also found in the difference between the casual observation, I know that that's a such and such, as it might be used in ordinary life, and the same utterance when a philosopher makes it. For when Moore says, I know that's such and such, I want to reply, you don't know anything. And yet I would not say that to anyone who was speaking without philosophical intention. That is, I feel rightly that these two mean to say something different. I like this part because I think Wittgenstein saying he has a very similar reaction to Moore's essay that I have, which is if you're playing the language game of a philosopher, then this essay is so stupid. Like, why are you doing this? It doesn't make sense for you to say you know something as a philosopher. But if you're playing the language game of just being an everyday person living their life, then yeah, it makes sense to say that you have a hand here. But don't mix these two language games. Don't mix the different meanings of what it means to know and just make this confusion, right? And that's I like that Wittgenstein seems to have had a very similar reaction that I have had to Moore's essay, which is like, why are you saying you know these things, right? Why are you doing that? That doesn't make sense to say that here. And yet you seem to be thinking that you're making a philosophical argument, and it just doesn't seem that you are. Um, and we have to separate these language games. This is something that Wittgenstein makes a big point of in the philosophical investigations, that philosophy is about um, performing this sort of linguistic therapy where we sort of separate language games and explain how different language games behave differently, and try not to mix them up. And Moore seems to have made the mistake of mixing up two different language games in his essays. Okay, let's continue to read a few more of these aphorisms before I finish up. So in 438, Wittgenstein says, it would not be enough to assure someone that I know what is going on at a certain place without giving him grounds to satisfy him that I am in a position to know. And here I want to point out that, of course, what grounds are required will vary from person to person, right? And even I might even need to like do some investigating with somebody to figure out what are the kinds of grounds that will satisfy them, right? And if someone's willing to be skeptical, I might have to like be a little bit more creative about the kinds of grounds that I give them to satisfy them, right? um this makes me think of like sometimes my brother and I, or other people too, but just specifically say my brother and I, will have two memories of something where we were both there, like something from our childhood, and our memories will disagree. And sometimes we can work backwards and give each other, well, do you remember this thing? And you remember this person being there? Sometimes we can work backwards and give it justification in order to get us on the same page. But, oh, you know what? You're right. You were right about this. Or, oh, I see that actually we saw the same memory from two different points of view, but actually it is the same. But other times when we do this, we realize we just fundamentally disagree about what happened at a particular point in our shared history, and we just have to agree to disagree, right? And there's nothing we can do to convince each other of each other's memories. And I think there's lots of examples like this in everyday life, that when you're talking to somebody, you have to find what it is you have in common, or what are the kinds of grounds or the kinds of arguments that you'll find satisfying in order to convince somebody that you know something about science, or you know something about history, or you know something about current events, or whatever it is. There's various different ways and various different arguments that people will want to know to understand how to whether or not they should believe something or not, right? Oh, I read it in the New York Times. For somebody who respects the New York Times, maybe that's enough, right? Or I read it on the internet. I might say, well, where on the internet did you read it? Like, is it a trusted source, right? And if you tell me a source that I find trustworthy, I might say, oh, okay, then it does seem to be a fact, right? But that doesn't make it absolutely certain. It just makes it, the kinds of thing that I'm willing to accept as grounds for belief, right? And these grounds will what people accept for grounds will change from person to person. In 467, Wittgenstein says, I am sitting with the philosopher in the garden. He says again and again, I know that that's a tree, pointing to a tree that is near us. Someone else arrives and hears this, and I tell him, this fellow isn't insane. We are only doing philosophy. Right. So you may have to clarify to someone, oh, he doesn't actually think there aren't trees there. It's just that we're having this philosophical argument where we're trying to doubt that and we're trying to, come to some. And that's an interesting point that he's making because again, he's pointing out that Moore is making this mistake of not sort of separating the two language games, that you can doubt the existence of your hand in a certain discussion and yet go through life uh, making the assumption that your hand is there, right? Um, that we have to sort of clarify which language game that we're playing sometimes. And then let's go to 521 and 612 to kind of wrap this up. In 521, he says, Moore's mistake lies in this, countering the assertion that one cannot know that by saying, I do know it. Right. And that's basically what Moore does in the entire essay. He just keeps saying that he does know it. And it feels very dogmatic. Let's go to 612 to try to end this discussion. So in 612, he says, I said I would combat the other man, but would I give him reasons? Certainly. But how far do they go? At the end of reasons comes persuasion. And he says in parentheses, thinks what happens when missionaries convert natives. And I think this is a very important reflection. We've probably all had this at some point where we're talking with somebody and we realize that we just don't seem to agree on many things. And we're having a hard time getting any traction anywhere. Right. I think a good example from my experience that I've had, like even just listening to other people, is if you see a Christian trying to debate an atheist, oftentimes it feels like they're just talking past each other and they have like no grounds that are in common, right? I mean, for one, a Christian believes that a God exists and created this world and so on and so forth. And atheist believes that there isn't a God and that's just not the right way to go about it. But they try, let's say they honestly want to try to have a discussion to try to persuade the other person of their beliefs. Well, at some point, if they can't find grounds that they have in common or arguments that the other one finds persuasive, then what do? Right? If they don't share any hinges in common at the base level, how do they possibly talk to each other? And when like these kinds of arguments stop working, what Wittgenstein points out is, what do we do then? Well, oftentimes we start yelling at each other because we hope that like the louder I speak, the more convincing I'll be, right? Or we might start being physically violent with somebody, or we might start wars with people. Or, as he points out, is that's when persuasion begins. And what he means is it's not about arguments anymore because we've lost the ability to talk with each other and we feel frustrated that we can't convince you of our beliefs. And so we just start persuading you with violence or with power. We have more money or we have more people, we have more dominance on the global scale, or so on and so forth. And I really think this is an important thing to reflect on. So many of us, I think, feel like we know things with perfect certainty about current events, about our own countries, or about our own families, or about our own belief systems. There's so many different examples of things that we feel like we know with absolute certainty. And it's reasonable to go about life having those assumptions, but at the very end, they are built on hinges that we can't justify. And I don't think we should reflect on it to produce paralysis, but I do think it's humbling to reflect on it, that really, someone has completely different base assumptions in us, then they're not necessarily more or less right than we are. They just have different assumptions. And if you think about it, the world seems to, or humans seem to be able to interact as much as we do. It's not like complete chaos, in part because we do tend to have certain assumptions in common about like, um, not, I don't think we agree about morality completely, but we at least seem to roughly agree that like murder is wrong. Again, not completely in every situation, but we seem to at least, think that murder is not completely right. And we at least seem to have certain assumptions about it's reasonable to assume that my hands are here and that the physical world is here. Anyway, I don't want to list them all out, but the fact that our hinges at the very base of our epistemology seem to be at least somewhat in common allow us to interact with each other and talk with each other and things like that. But it's also interesting to reflect on the fact that we also do not agree on very many of the assumptions that we make at our core, and that's what causes disagreement. And but if you still feel like, you know what, I am absolutely certain, and what I'm saying is true, that's when you start to get angry, and you might, respond either by, physical violence or some kind of manipulation behind the scenes or some kind of use of power to try to persuade people. And in some sense, it's sort of unavoidable because there isn't anything that's absolutely certain. And if you want to persuade, you try to argue with people, you try to talk, but at some point, there's nothing else we can do. I mean, please don't misunderstand what I'm saying. I'm not justifying war or anything like that, but there's no clean answers here, right? There's only reflections, I think, and I really enjoy Wittgenstein's writing and uncertainty and philosophical investigations because I think it's just honest. I think this is just how things are at some base level. Of course, other philosophers are probably going to want to come around and say, well, what should we do here? What are the values we should hold? What are the base assumptions that we should make as a society or as a people? And I think those are reasonable discussions to have. But I think that for the most part, Wittgenstein is not going to tell you what you should assume. He's not going to give you normative claims like that. He's simply pointing out that we're not certain of anything. But yet we use this word certain to say that amongst certain people playing a similar language game, we are certain when we play that language game that such and such is the case. Right. When we do science, we feel reasonably certain that such and such laws hold and things like that. And there's nothing wrong with saying those things. But in some absolute sense, we are not certain and we'll never will be, right? Because there's really no way to establish anything with certainty in our language games, and that's just a fact that we need to accept. And I think, and I hope, though I'm not so sure. I just think that this kind of reflection can produce a certain humbleness and maybe even a certain humanism, just to like, feel a connection with humans in general. That we all just, we have to pick certain values, and of course I think those values are somewhat dictated to our biology and our evolution and all these other things, but we have to just sort of pick certain hinges and build from there and try to work with each other and understand, but they're no more or less, certain or true than anyone else's. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't defend our values. I'm still going to defend science, even though I think that it, at some very base level, is no more certain, absolutely certain than anything else. But I still think it's a very useful way of describing the world and a very useful way um, of trying to understand and make decisions about what's going on. Okay, I'm going to stop discussion here, though I can talk about this a lot. I really would love to hear what you think about this. If you disagree with anything I said, or you want to talk about it further, I would love to hear what you have to say in the comments. And I think I'm gonna do some more videos on Wittgenstein because I just really like what's going on there. So please like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know what you think. And I hope to see you at another video.